Hello, everypony, and today I'll be reading more Awoken. But first, let me remind you that this is gory and stuff and not good for kids, basically. And also, I've been wanting to write a fanfiction for a while, and I have some of it done already, but I haven't had the time, so I'm planning on tomorrow morning getting some work on that done. And having an editor would be nice, of course, so if there's anyone interested in editing my works, that would be awesome. But yeah, anyways, I'm not going to be reading tomorrow morning because I'm going to instead be writing. Amazing. So anyways, shall we begin? I've stoked the fire, seen more pain than you can know. The tears of the broken have washed away my soul. A mere day after the brutal murder of the filly Pegasus, and to the other's great surprise, I was back under the domed roof again, doubling as a mechanic and a floor supervisor. I remember how surreal it felt for me that first day in the field, how alien. A mere day ago, I was in the horseshoes of those I could now command. At the time, I hadn't been given the full bodysuit that the guards got to wear around, but I did have a white vest trimmed neatly with yellow. My ID card hung from a clip on my collar. I had gotten to wear a helmet while doing the mechanic part of the job as well. Aside from the fact that my title as a working pony had changed, my mindset had as well. I was almost constantly craving for these lively feelings I had felt while standing over that bleeding Pegasus, the empowerment, the satisfaction, the one time where I could have control over something in my dreary life. Forced respect to the overmare eventually mutated into outright admiration. She became a role model. I found her ways of total control very effective. She could disarm any problem with a look, and every single pony, male or female, young or old, were compelled by fear to obey her. I sincerely wanted to master her art as I settled into my new position in the factory. I found myself striving more and more every day to model my actions after her own. On the floor, I had been ruthless, lashing out with my taser at the slightest falter, bucking those that were too slow. To my sickening satisfaction, I quickly gained a notorious reputation for being the pony to keep away from. This was success to me, a ruined concept of reality. I liked being feared because as long as I was feared, I was in control, and I craved control more than anything else. The next catalyst of change for me in the factory came in the form of an unexpected rebellion. At this point in time, I had been working in the factory for a year. A fresh load of flunkies out had arrived to be slaughtered, and I was up in the workstation, tuning the control panel for the Pegasus device. Yes, that's the Golith of a machine had a name. That's its name. Well, yeah, I kinda knew that, but Golith. That's a new word for me. Amazing. The new load was like the last, and every other before it. Nervous, afraid, insecure. I was far beyond sympathy, but I did have a strong concept of what was going through their minds. As Rainbow Dash, along with her representatives, arrived at the podium in preparation for the speech, I had stopped what I was doing to watch the show. Out of every other time that the group had walked up to the podium, I remembered the details from this particular occasion the most. Firstly, one of the representatives had stepped up to the base. By now, you've all clearly determined that you are not going into exile. There is no departure, there never was. You are in the Rainbow Factory. You will never leave the factory. And while you may be called useless, that's also not entirely true. You're worthless to the flock as a pony, but you still have purpose. Purpose to all the ponies in this land, far and wide. You get to help us make rainbows. Beautiful, magical rainbows. Doesn't that excite you? As expected, it hadn't. In response to their reaction, I grinned briefly. My attention was drawn back to the crowd as one brave Pegasus, cotton candy pink if I remember correctly, stepped to the front of the crowd. There was always one or two that stood up to the authority. They were usually the first to go. If only the pink filly realized that, she was sealing her fate. Raising her head to look defiantly at the spokespony, she had shouted a retort. How could you ever get away with this? How could Celestia or even Luna know about this and tolerate it? It's slavery, it's torture. I realized with a start that that was a good question. Leaning in a bit more, I watched as the spokespony stepped down and Rainbow Dash stepped forward. After looking over the audience, she spoke up and explained in that rough, authoritative voice of hers. 1,000 years ago, when Celestia banished Luna from Equestria, sent her to the moon, she was charged with 3 tasks. She originally was in charge of raising the sun and showering the land with rainbows, but with the moon being an additional task, she had to hand down the responsibility of rainbows. Celestia entrusted the Pegasi of Cloudsdale to make the rainbows for her from then on. For the first dozen years, we were given powerful unicorns to help create spectra. Spectra is pure pigment, pure color. Everything is full of spectra, but you can't harvest it. You can never separate color from an object. So it was made artificially with magic. For a moment, Rainbow Dash paused to let her words soak in. A dense veil of silence had fallen over the crowd as each and every pony registered the new information. Then the overmare continued. That is, until our top engineers made a breakthrough. They discovered an ingenious way to extract pigment. It was so beautiful, and even a simple machine could do it. But couldn't be done with just anything. The conditions had to be right. Another pause. I could tell she was becoming excited as she anticipated the reaction following whatever she was about to say. It had to be live ponies, only in ponies where magic and spectra ran freely together. That was the trigger, both for the catalyst and the captive pony sanity. As that wonderfully sadistic cyan-colored Pegasus laughed maniacally, gazing down at the panicking crowd that had now been pitched into frenzy, a single pained voice cut through the commotion. I thought you loved me! Rainbow Dash's laugh had caught in her throat as she looked about to find the source of the volatile scream. When she finally honed in, and to my deepest confusion, that invincible mare hesitated. The single strand of conscious thought that flew through my mind at that point was something I remember to this very day. Rainbow Dash, my role model. Rainbow Dash, the overmare. Rainbow Dash, the head of the Rainbow Factory. Faltered. For a period of time after that, I was too dazed to really register the entirety of what was happening. What I did get through was that the orange-colored Pegasus, the one who has instigated all of this, seemed to know Rainbow Dash personally. What really snapped me back to reality was the retaliation. Soon after the demonstration it had happened, that same damn Pegasus, accompanied by what seemed to be a friend of hers, Sunshine Yellow Filly, riled the flunks out with a few encouraging words. Seconds later, the crowd erupted into the air in a flurry of feathers, reverse of roles. Then had then taken place as the unprepared guards were attacked. At the time of the upheaval, I and my fellow mechanics were mostly ignored, but I do, however, having to defend myself on a few occasions. I do, however, remember. Derp, derp. As the uprising got further and further out of Foof, my colleagues fled in fear for their lives. I was about to join them, but then I heard Rainbow Dash screeching out a single command to kill them all, and saw her taking off from the gangplank to fight in the turmoil down below. I felt a strong drive to go to my hero's aid, even though at that point I didn't really have any formal combat training. I was a good enough improviser. That hour or so of combat was gory and satisfying. By the end of it all, my white suit had been stained a deep red. I killed many in that brutal battle. I had fallen into a methodical and effective pattern, see? Defend, attack, back and forth, until the very last rebellious Pegasi fell, overcome finally by exhaustion, and was trampled to death. At this point in time, Rainbow Dash had disappeared somewhere in pursuit of the lone orange filly that had started all of this. I remember wishing bitterly, standing defiant amongst the corpses of friends and foe, that bitch of a Pegasus would be brought to justice. In the end, I had been glad to say she was disposed manually by the Overmare herself. Mere minutes after the orange Pegasus had been fed to the machine and the tubes began to pump out the spectra, Rainbow Dash descended from the stout top of the Pegasus device to meet me on the floor. As she approached, I stopped wheeling the vat containing the Pegasus spectra and saluted her in respect. "Stand down, would you?" Her voice was liquid, comforting. I stood down. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" I asked. She smiled brightly. "Few things, soldier. For starter, I'd like you to stop calling me ma'am." I nodded uncertainly. "Sure thing," I drawled off as I stretched for the appropriate word. "Dash would do just fine." With the Overmare's response, I felt my heart flutter with honor. "Of course, Dash." I deliciously savored that word on my tongue, reveling in how it sounded coming from me. "Better." She paused and looked off into the distance. "Secondly, you did a good job this afternoon, soldier. When given the chance, you didn't flee. That speaks in volumes to me, you know. I look for your sort." And then, as an absent-minded addition, "I knew I'd choose right when deciding between ending your life all that time ago or keeping you around." She refocused and gained. Again I found myself gazing into those mesmerizing eyes. "I like to promote you, soldier. Draft you into my core group, the orchestrators." My heart stopped completely then. Were my ears betraying me? Was I dreaming? No, it was really happening. 3 days later, I had moved up the ranks into the orchestrator's upper circle. I had a nice, new private living quarters, and all the time I could have dreamed for around Dash. The days, from then on, began to fade together, blurring the lines between creating a waking hell for the new and coming spectre donors, and living in a self-induced one as the heinous crimes committed came back to haunt me in my sleep. I was too far in, though, now to do anything about it, so all I could do was go forwards. But life is not as it seems. Should I take a chance for freedom and throw it all down the drain? I've been in prison. Please burn my transgressions away. When I awoke, I was sprawled out on the bathroom floor, felt groggy. The question that buzzed around inside my head was what had happened to me. Shakily I got to my hoofs, It was then that I noticed the shattered glass littering the floor like snowflakes. With a start, I partially recalled the events of last night. I had shattered that mirror. I don't remember why, but I'd been angry at something. Shaking once to clear my head, I went over to the sink and splashed my face. Briefly, I took note of the blood splatter across the chrome. It looked like fireworks. Feeling better every moment, I walked out of the washroom and into my bedroom. Once there, I reached into a drawer, pulled out my bodysuit. After I had put it on, I made my way to the metal countertop, where my StatCon was charging. Taking it off the charger, I clipped it around my ankle. With a small beeping noise, it came to life. I was set and ready to start my day. Leaving my room, I entered into an elevator. After the doors closed and I pushed the basement button, I leaned back on the railing and waited out the trip. As the elevator came to life and began to drop, I felt a sudden bout of concern. A moment from the night before flashed behind my eyelids. It was of me gazing at my own rage-filled reflection in the mirror and then smashing it. Concern turned to insecurity. Recently, I've been having a harder and harder time coping with, well, myself. My strange nightly activities had suddenly started up about 3 weeks prior, the night after I had talked to the new flock of Spectra donors, and had only gotten worse from then on. Last night was the first time I had actually caused physical pain. What was happening to me? As far as I was concerned, I had ting. My frantic pondering was cut short as the elevator grinded to a stop and beeped. It was notifying me that I had just reached rock bottom. Shaking my head, I cracked my back and puffed my chest out. The time to feel was over. I was the ominous orchestrator now. Straightening up, I marched out of the small space and into the long, narrow hall. To my left and right, hot pipes hissed and groaned, threatening to burn if any pony was daft enough to get close. In front of me, the domed roof of the Rainbow Factory rose, and there, planted smack dab in the middle, the Pegasus device greeted my cheerless eyes. It was vibrating and whistling, pumping out a fresh load of spectra. As I entered the chamber, I got predominant reaction from those I crossed paths with. A salute from the factory worker or a whimper from the factory slaves. Taking off of the blackened ground, I flew to the upper gangplank, landing gracefully by the grinder at the top of the Goliath machine. That's how it's pronounced, Goliath, meaning big. At least, I'm pretty sure. The last remnants, like from David and Goliath. But anyways, the last remnants of its recent victim were still being churned up. Without even batting a glance, I walked around the Pegasus device and out along a protruding spoke to a framed hole in the wall. Entering the gap, I continued onwards till I arrived at a metal door. The door in front of me slid open, and I came out into a long hallway. One way, the direction I should be heading in, led to the small conference room, where Dash and the rest of the orchestrators were beginning their meeting. The other led to the balcony. If paradise could be created, it would have formed that broad ledge, positioned strategically so that any pony who stood on it could always see the land and the sky at once. I adored that smooth piece of cloud. Seeing the natural light at the end of the hallway momentarily made me stop and stare. I decided conclusively that I would visit it after the meeting was over. Ripping my gaze away, I turned and made my way towards the conference room. On arrival, I pressed a button. The door that was connected to the terminal silently slid open. "So you chose to come in the end. Good." Dash smiled. "We were just about to start the presentation. Please sit down." I nodded and cantered to my designated spot around the horseshoe-shaped table, marked out by a tinted name tag. When I settled in, Dash nodded and began to speak. "Now that we're all here, I'd like to start. For those of you who didn't know, today marks the 3rd anniversary of the uprising. Yes, the one where Scootaloo," her voice cracked on saying the name, "rallied the rest of the delegate flight school failures and fought back against our authority." She moved over to the wall and clicked a button. The large screen at the head of the table flickered to life. "I've recovered the video feed from the Flores cameras that day, and I'd like you all to watch it. Let's see if you can figure out where we went wrong." The lights dimmed and my attention was drawn to the screen. As the footage began to roll, I felt a twang of something deep down in my heart. As the events of that day unfolded again in front of me, I began to shiver. What was going on? My stomach clenched and I felt as though I was about to throw up. Rather suddenly, I recalled something an old friend of mine had told me once. He had been one of the 2 I had in those earlier stages of my life working in the rainbow factory. He was a pony of few words, so when he spoke, it was because he was telling you something very important. He talked to me the day after I murdered that filly. He had told that in the end things caught up to you, and that all the crimes you've committed over your life eventually come back to bite you in the tail. At the time, I only raged at him. Now, however, 3.5 years later, I finally registered his words. Was that what was happening to me? Were my past atrocities, those dark monsters locked away in my subconscious, beginning to come back to ruin me? I wished dearly that this was not the case. But then again, would simply wishing change the outcome of what was going to happen? Solve the problem? No. Action would, though. Only through action could I stop something. Before returning my attention back to the screen, I concluded that the next time I started acting weird, I'd catch myself and counter my behavior. I'd come this far. There was no turning back now. As the screen died, Rainbow Dash rose from her seat and cantered over to face us all. "You've all seen the footage now, so tell me, what was our deadfall?" One of the orchestrators, burly colt with hot poker eyes and a crooked grin, raised his hoof. The overmare turned her attention to him. "The guards were our downfall, ma'am. The revolt was something we were not prepared for. I think the problem behind it all was a simple lack of training." He paused momentarily. "Then again, nowadays, and only because of the revolt, we've incorporated new elements into our routine. We shouldn't have to deal with that problem again." "Wrong and wrong," was Rainbow Dash's straight-to-the-point response. She emphasized her distaste by pointing one of her covered hooves at the speaker. "We've just been lucky that it hasn't reoccurred. I can bet you that no matter how well our soldiers are trained, they will not be ready to contain a problem that scale effectively." For a moment she stopped talking, choosing instead to look around at the 13 orchestrators in silence. Then she continued, "Are there any other brilliant theories?" Nonchalantly, a filly with a tattered blue mane lifted her hoof. She was sitting right beside me. "It was the wings, ma'am." I looked over in amusement at the pony. What a stupid response! Closing any eyes, I waited for Dash to ridicule her. She didn't, and instead gave the Pegasus time she needed to explain. "They used them to fly above us. This gave them the opportunity to occupy the upper ground. What more, being smaller than the guards, they were faster, not to mention more desperate. Exactly, Rainbow Dash explained. Exactly. She started smiling again, deviously. Her eyes began to glitter in anticipation. And on that note, let me introduce you to my newest idea. Stifling pause. Fillies and Gentle Colt, we're going to de-wing the bastards. In the wake of her proposal, a wave the size of the Pegasus device smashed into me. My world swam, and I was swept under. This could not be happening. Was Dash serious? De-winging was by far the most demoralizing and humiliating thing one Pegasus could do to another. It was that one thing that had always remained taboo. From the sadistic killer to the innocent fool, I've seen my share of cruelty, but this de-winging business went far beyond that. I didn't think I could do something like that to a defenseless Pegasus. She looked at me. You've been given the honor of overlooking the operations. The words jolted me out of my thoughts and into a reality even worse than I could have created with my mind. Me? I said, sounding like an idiot. No, the one behind you, she replied sarcastically. Well, I started to say. I was more than apprehensive. Well, she repeated. Her wings flared in annoyance. Do you mean to say that you have no desire to run the program? I caught myself. Of course I do, Dash. I was just wondering where I'd be located is all. Her wings fell to rest idly again. I sighed in relief. As I suspected, I've always known that you'd be the colt for the job. I think you'll do excellently. You start next week, when the new shipment arrives. Thank you, I nodded and got up. I knew that I'd start screaming in hysteria or something if I stayed in the room for much longer. I have some things to tend to. Gentle Colt, fillies. I nodded at the other orchestrators. I'll see you on the floor. As soon as the door slid closed behind me, I fell. My breathing was choppy, and my heart twitched sickeningly. Willing myself to get up, I stumbled down to the hall and out onto the balcony. When I arrived, I collapsed exhausted and with only a half notion of getting back up. Lying with one hoof dangling over the edge, I looked down at the world. We were drifting over Ponyville. Far below, like colorful ants, ponies milled about, bartering, interacting, playing in the fields, all oblivious to the fact that Equestria's largest slaughterhouse was floating right above their heads. I felt a twang of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Sadness. I tried desperately to remember my life before the Rainbow Factory, but it came up blank. I realized with a start that I had forgotten what it felt like to live in a normal society. I began to cry, deep, heaving convulsions that threatened to rip my lungs out and tear my heart in half. For minutes or maybe hours, I had no way to keep track. I sobbed, crying till I had no tears left to shed. Only when I had drained myself dry did I take a deep breath, and using the railing as a crutch, got up. Hoof steps behind me, and I turned to see Rainbow Dash arriving at the hall. Paying little heed to me, the mare walked right up next to the railing and gazed at the horizon. A moment of unease went by. Life is a simple game, she said, looking out over the balcony. And we have become the game masters. We've set up a world inside of the bigger one and controlled every single thing that went on. We became gods. She stopped and looked at me. I am a god, and those worthless souls down there and up here are my pawns. She smiled and turned away from me. We've played them well. They live their lives oblivious to what goes on up here. I nodded in empty agreement. We've done a good job, I replied. You've done a good job, soldier. The subject of the conversation had just switched. Look at how you are now, and then compare yourself to how you used to be, simple mortal, living life controlled by fear and instinct, living in the shadow of those that were above you. I've seen you rise up the ranks in the factory. I remember clearly the first day you arrived here. Do you? Yes, it was 4.5 years ago. Your memory is good. Pause. Now, think of this. Dash turned to stare at me for a final time. Her eyes became cruel. Took you 4.5 years to make it here, but it will only take you a second to knock you back down. I began to bite my tongue. I'm watching you, soldier. You've performed the trials and earned your place here in the upper ring of power. However, that does not mean you slipped under the radar. My tooth punctured my tongue, and I swallowed blood. Are we clear? I nodded and began to back away, slowly making to the door. The heartless purple gaze followed my every move. And that's about all we can do today. So, thank you for watching. Feel free to comment, rate, subscribe, favorite, whatnot. Let's see. What else is there to mention? I'll be working on the story tomorrow, and should get this edited soon. And it feels like I should go yada yada yada, blah blah blah. That's just about it. So, and a burp, just for good measures. Well, farewell, good day, goodbye, see ya.